Ruth, could you just tell us a little bit about what is Furtherfield exactly?
Furtherfield's an arts organisation that's been going since the mid-90s, so since the web got going as a place that anyone could publish to and that people were shaping the web. And 20 years on, we're an international community for arts, technology and social change, so we put on exhibitions, labs and debates. We work internationally, but we're located in Finsbury Park in North London.
Yes, I mean, basically Furtherfield started because it's got a history in pirate radio from Bristol and pirate television, and creating its own platforms for kind of creative communities that are slightly exploring more kind of interesting ideas than traditional art contexts.
It's really about bringing people together to think critically about how technology is changing the way we live together and the way power operates in the network society. That's the kind of core focus of everything that we do.
Okay, cool. You've kind of answered my next question a little bit. Then was what were the goals or aims of Furtherfield? Is there anything you want to expand on?
So one of the goals is to create a much more collaborative culture around art and practice with technology. Technology doesn't necessarily have to be the kind of at the top of the hierarchical tree, but it's in reflection to how technology is changing our society, and how those ideas that are coming through technology, we can ask questions at the same time. So we work with different people to ask questions with them, but also but in a collaborative context or collaborative way.
One of our goals was to create a new context for art, because when we got going, the Brit art scene, headed up by Saatchi, was kind of creating a very particular kind of art world that was about creating a few art stars. And because the web was a space that people could collaborate on and build shared spaces and shared platforms, we wanted to kind of really start to take control of how we made work together, what it meant, defining, reviewing, kind of really creating the space in which people could come across the work and what it would mean to them.
And the other thing is that one of the issues around Brit art and Saatchi is that really the art was only driven by ownership of the culture. So what happens is that they come along, but just because they're very rich, that means they can change a whole history of art and can dominate the narrative of what art is.
Yeah.
And so they can actually create particular canons that don't relate to the artist or even a nation of people. And I just think that we wanted to connect to kind of like an indigenous version of our culture, and the artists have been that, and see where that's coming from, rather than just responding to the canons that are being kind of proposed by a more elite society.
Okay, cool. Okay, has there been kind of any, would you say there's a conscious design behind Furtherfield?
The most core element of the conscious design that is built into everything we do is to keep systems as open as possible to as diverse people as possible, so that we're constantly trying to create spaces where people can bring things to the organisation and to the users of the organisation, whether it's knowledge, tools, skills, different background experiences, so they're bringing that to the space rather than having a very controlled space which is controlled from the centre.
Yes, and also I think another kind of design element which helps the way that we work is where we kind of think it's kind of coming from a platforming perspective, where you platform your own identity rather than have it designed for you by someone else. So you can do that individually or in a group, and also being aware of networks, as in digital networks, but also systems thinking, but also infrastructures where you can build your own infrastructure to take control of your own kinds of manoeuvrings in culture, and where you can be much more clear about those decisions using those design patterns and processes, and they remain relevant all the time.
I'd say that one of the things that we're probably quite unusual for is that we really want to keep spaces open for negotiation, so that any systems that we design, we consciously leave spaces for people to be involved in thinking about what will make them better, what will make them work better for them in ways that we can't predict.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the design isn't actually necessarily conceptual from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually part of design is where there's a kind of messiness as well, isn't there, really, where there's a human factor that takes control and for its own means.
Hey Mark, a couple of years ago we kind of met up after a long period of not really having been in contact and talked about how different things are involved in, and through that you kind of invited us as a permaculture group to kind of engage with Furtherfield. I was wondering how you see kind of the work you're doing already, or what Furtherfield are doing. How does that kind of work or fit with permaculture kind of thinking and ideas?
Well, the way I see it from Furtherfield's perspective of how it relates to permaculture, or rather Spiral Seed's version of permaculture, mm-hmm. or design for action, mm-hmm. Is that it connects to a grassroots element with people, where it asks difficult questions about society, where it's not in absolute terms. And I quite like that, because like when you do some of your workshops and they ask questions about, say for instance, something as simple as a box of tea that you bought from a shop, and mm-hmm. the history of that box of tea, it's really important where that tea comes from, and mm-hmm. the history of that tea, and the relationship that that tea has with the world, and all the people that have designed it, and who, what wages are involved of the people that are involved, and where it's grown. And we feel very much the same about technology, where you have to take responsibility about how that technology is built, rather than just looking at the interface of things. And I think what I like about permaculture is that it pulls away the illusion, the interface, and it looks at the materiality of life. Mm-hmm. And that's what excites me about permaculture. And I think we have a very similar perspective in our own way of being.
I totally agree with that. I think there's a connection between artists who think about networks and who take networks as their medium, and a connection with ecological thinking. And that's ecological not just in terms of natural systems, but also social systems. And I think that's a real connection with the permaculture stuff. Mm. It's the fact that we think systemically about material things and the way things are organised.
And obviously some of the ethics that you've been exploring in permaculture really links very strongly to where we come from as well, doesn't it? So there's a lot of that as well.
Okay, I've got another one question for you, Mark, because of our kind of background. That very much where we came from was like the punk rock thing, and the thing there was very much DIY, do it yourself. But I've heard you've been talking about do it with others. Can you know, how does that...
We've been talking about doing it with others.
Yeah.
Doing it with others is a play on doing it with others. But to be more serious, it's like do it yourself, DIY culture, with hacking, and also a lot of kind of in ecology, DIY culture is very much about building, your own gardens and cooking and find your own way around, making your own tools, and we enjoy that side of things with technology. How you can show different, like we're very much into free and open source culture, and we believe that everyday culture should be free and open source, just like technology should be. So therefore, rather than using, say, Apple or Microsoft, we believe that you use Linux because it doesn't cost anything, and also you don't have to buy so much rich technology, therefore you're saving the planet more. And in a way, do it with others is a version of artists and technologists and other types of people that work collaboratively together, that are forming a project that's not about an individual as the genius, as the kind of the master of others, because of this illusion of genius, which is kind of a very patriarchal approach. And so in a way, it's a deliberate way of even challenging the idea of the curator, let alone challenging the idea of the artist as genius. And obviously, groups like Saatchi and a lot of institutions earn their kinds of their value systems are based on the kind of patriarchal genius, and do it with others is a kind of decentralisation of that idea. And so we have projects. We have projects online. Well, like mail art projects when people have been sending art through the postal system, but also using kinds of everyday spaces to make their art together, but also in galleries where you have a kind of equal premise for everyone to do a collaborative piece of work, but also they do works that are sequenced. So in other words, you make a work, then you add to it, and another piece of work comes to that. There's lots of different elements about it. Do you want to add anything to that? Or? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I like the way it's kind of evolution from do it yourself, which was always about rejecting kind of corporate, everything. Whether it's the music industry, it's about rejecting corporate music. Make your own music, but then that kind of evolves into do it with others. Yeah,
Yeah, there is that punk element about it where you pick up the tools and to make social change with other people.
Yeah, actually, the question of tool making is really, this idea of like you do it yourself, you find your own way of doing it. But I think do it with others was adding this other layer onto it, that you come together and you make your own tools for collaboration.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of because the web for us was all about collaborating with people who are really different to us, people who are maybe on the other side of the world, speaking a different language, and it's that process of shared tool production that was really important.
Yeah, so you found what happens is that you end up with a peer ownership of a shared culture, which was so exciting about punk.
Yeah,
it was a very similar thing. Everyday people meeting each other for the first time who would never normally meet, that are building something very equal.
Absolutely. Okay, Ruth, I'd say it's been around for over 20 years now. So a slightly more kind of reflective question, like how successful do you feel you've been sort of with Furtherfield? Do you feel you met the aims you started out with, or...?
It's interesting because I think when we started, we weren't. It wasn't as though we really set ourselves a goal. We felt compelled to do the things we were compelled to do in the way that lots of artists are doing. So we were kind of feeling our way. We were unhappy with certain things, and we wanted to kind of create a place in which we could work with people. We could talk about the difficult topics of the day, which weren't getting a proper platform elsewhere. And I think we've got a lot more. We're actually much more strategic now than we used to be. And when we moved into the heart of Finsbury Park about 5 years ago, that's when we really started to get a sense of a much more kind of carefully defined purpose, and making very careful decisions about how to present the kind of complex and abstract and often quite critical ideas to a very broad public. And I think that's been very inspiring and informative to us, that we've been able to experiment with ways to make complex things more accessible to more people and to be part of a much wider conversation. And there's we're a relatively small organisation with a very wide network, which allows us to actually engage with things with emerging cultures. Like recently, we've been working with blockchain technology, which hasn't really kind of found its way into the mainstream, but because of the networks that we're working with, we were able to kind of get in there really early and start to think about how to make what the potential impact of this is going to be more available and more discussable for more people. So in those terms, I think, I don't know if we're successful. It's probably better for other people to judge on that, but we're certainly kind of doing everything we can.
I think one of the key kinds of behaviours that we have is that we tend to be exploring questions before mainstream explores questions. Another example is drone technology. We were exploring drone technology before other people, but what we found is that because we're in the actual park of Finsbury Park, is that a lot of everyday people actually were asking questions at the same time, but there wasn't a platform for them to actually share those questions. So even though, say, newspapers weren't referring to a lot of these questions at the time, and television wasn't discussing it, and institutions weren't, we were, and then other people were actually asking questions around drones and the politics of drones, and you know, how do you make a drone, and where does a drone that's used for military come from, and who pays for those drones, and where do all those bits come from around the world, and all these kind of questions that people weren't asking, because there's one of the biggest issues around military drones was the fact that it was illegal to actually not only fly certain drones around certain territories around the world, but actually it was illegal to have them made in certain countries because they were termed as military weapons. But if you send parts of a cannon around the world, it can only be made in particular countries and delivered around, and therefore it becomes legal if it's a component but not as the whole thing. And lots of people were involved in workshops around that, and so a lot of the kind of everyday people weren't only just faced with exhibitions about drones, they were involved in the workshops, and they were packed. And there's this kind of idea that people aren't interested in complicated things, but actually it's a mythology. They are. It's just they're not given a chance to have real proper conversations of what these difficult questions are, and then they remain mysterious. And we'd like to unpack that and ask the questions with people rather than tell them, if you see what I mean.
So maybe your question is about whether we think we've been successful. I guess a sensible way to think about that would be to know what we think success would look like. And I think there's probably many things that we're aiming at, but two things that are really important to us. One is, do the people who come into our gallery or into our events feel welcome and feel able to engage with the things that we're doing? That's really important to us. No matter, we just want whoever comes across the threshold to feel that the conversation is for them, because we think that these things are the business of us all. You know, these questions are the business of us all. So that's important. And the other thing is that artists feel like there's a space where they can explore and play with and kind of just feel comfortable to go in any direction in relation to the tools that they have in their hands and their experience of life.
Great. Sounds like a good conclusion, yeah? Great, thank you.